The envelope had sat on the kitchen table for 18 months. Etty Vaughn knew it was there every morning when she came downstairs. She knew it was there when she made her single cup of coffee and stood at the window watching the light come across the Montana hills, the way it had come across those hills for the 33 years she and Rowan had lived in that house. She knew it was there when she went to bed at night and lay in the dark, listening to the house settle around her the way old houses do when the person who filled them is gone. Rowan had pressed it into her hands the morning of his last day. Not dramatically, not with a long speech or a prepared statement or anything that announced itself as a final thing. He had simply reached across the bed in the gray light before dawn and set the envelope against her palm and closed her fingers around it. His hand was very thin by then. The bones of it felt like something she could break without meaning to, and she had held it carefully the way she had learned to hold fragile things, which was firmly enough that they knew they were held and gently enough that the holding did not damage them. He said, "Don't open it until you're ready to walk alone." She had not known what that meant. She had thought in the weeks that followed that it meant she needed to grieve first, to move through the hard months, to find some equilibrium on the other side of loss before she could receive whatever the envelope contained. She had done all of that, or as much of it as a person can do, which is never quite all of it, but enough to continue. She kept the envelope on the kitchen table where she could see it. Not hidden, not locked away. Just present the way certain things need to be present before you are ready for them. The morning she opened it was a Tuesday in April, 2 years after Rowan died. She had woken at 5:15, as she always woke the body's habits, outlasting everything that used to make them necessary. And she had lain in the dark for the 3 seconds she always allowed herself before getting up, and on the 3rd second she understood in the way that certain understandings arrive without announcement and without drama, that she was ready. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and opened the envelope carefully. You did not rush the things that mattered. You did not tear through them. Inside were 3 things: a folded map, old paper foxed at the edges and creased where it had been folded and refolded over what looked like many years. She opened it on the table and smoothed it flat with both hands. It was a survey chart drawn with the precision that engineering work required, dated 1947 in the bottom right corner. A thin pencil line ran east through mountain country she recognized as the high terrain north of Belden. Beside the line, in small, careful letters that were not the letters of the original survey, Cutter Pass Spur. And in the lower right corner, in the same hand so faint, she had to angle the paper toward the window light to read it, E. Cale Vaughn, verified 1961. She looked at that notation for a long time. Rowan's name. His full name, the one that appeared on their marriage certificate, and his engineering licenses and the deed to this house. He had been 12 years old in 1961, which meant his father had taken him to verify this survey, or he had found it and verified it himself, or something else entirely that she did not yet have the information to understand. The second thing was a key. Small iron, heavier than it looked. The kind of key that belonged to something built to last, rather than something built to be convenient. The third thing was a single sheet of paper folded once with 3 words written in Rowan's handwriting. The same handwriting she had read on grocery lists and birthday cards and the notes he left on the counter when he came home late. 3 words, nothing else. No explanation. Cutter Pass Spur. She sat with those 3 things in front of her for a long time. Her coffee went cold. The light moved across the kitchen floor the way it had always moved, the way it would keep moving long after she was gone. She thought about what Rowan had said, ready to walk alone. He had not meant grief. He had meant this, an actual walk, alone. She was 71 years old. She had not done anything like this in perhaps 20 years. She had a left hip that complained in cold weather, and knees that registered every change in barometric pressure, and a doctor in Belden who had told her twice in the careful language of doctors who know their patients well enough to be direct, to be thoughtful about strenuous activity. She also had somewhere in the back of the closet a canvas pack she had used for a hiking trip with Rowan in 1987 and 31 years of nursing that had taught her that careful people outlast reckless ones every time. and that the body will do considerably more than it believes it can if you pay proper attention to it and give it the information it needs. She spent 2 weeks preparing, methodically the way she had always done things that mattered. She weighed the pack on the bathroom scale at each packing stage, removing anything that did not serve a specific necessary purpose. She tested her boots on the road outside the house, adding distance each day, noting which muscles complained and giving them the time they needed to adjust before adding more. She visited the library in Belden and found what she could about the Cutter Pass spur, which was not much. A paragraph in a regional railroad history from 1978. A mention in a forestry survey from 1963. A brief notice in a Belden newspaper from 1971 about the line being formally decommissioned. It had run into the mountains and stopped. No junction at the far end. No clear record of its original purpose or who had funded its construction. She wrote what she knew in the small notebook she planned to carry. She left the 3 words from Rowan's note at the top of the first page, and under them she wrote his name, and under that, the date she was starting. She did not tell anyone where she was going. This was not recklessness. It was a considered decision, the kind she had made many times in 31 years of nursing, when the right action was not the comfortable one. The people she might have told would have tried to stop her, and she did not have the energy for that argument. She left a sealed envelope on the kitchen table with her neighbor Ruth's name on it, containing a note explaining that she had gone walking in the Cutter Pass area north of Belden and would be back within 10 days. If she was not back in 12 days, Ruth should call the county sheriff's office. She weighted the envelope with a spare house key. Then she put the pack on her back, 36 pounds, weighed twice on the bathroom scale, and got in her truck and drove to Belden. The pack felt different on her back than it had in 1987. Not heavier, more present. She was aware of each pound in a way she had not been at 50, the weight having a specificity it had lacked when her body had more reserve to absorb it. But she had planned for this. She walked from the truck, slowly finding the rhythm of it before she needed it. You did not fight a pack. You learned to carry it the way you learned to carry any sustained burden, by accepting its weight as part of yourself rather than something imposed from outside. The old rail bed was not difficult to find once she knew what to look for. The landscape announced it to anyone paying attention. A uniform grade cutting along the hillside contour, where nature never cut uniform grades. A corridor of second-growth fir and alder, slightly younger than the surrounding forest, filling in the cleared right-of-way over the 50 years since the line went quiet. Occasional fragments of old telegraph poles, most fallen their wire, long since stripped away. She followed the grade east into the hills. The morning was cool and very clear. The sky, the deep specific blue that comes to Montana in early October, when the summer haze has cleared and the air has taken on a density, a weight that the summer months never quite achieve. Her breath showed white ahead of her. The frost on the old rail ties caught the early light and held it briefly before the climbing sun dissolved it. She walked with her eyes moving between the path ahead and the landscape around her. Rowan had explained railroading to her for 30 years in the patient and detailed way. He explained everything he cared about, and she had listened with the half-attention of someone who loves the sound of another person's voice more than the content of what they are saying. She understood this about herself now, and it sat in her chest with a particular weight that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but something adjacent to both. She had loved the sound of him talking. She had not always heard what he said, but she heard it now, standing inside the landscape he had described. She could read the grade the way he had taught her to read it. Never steeper than 2%, she felt it in her legs, the gentle persistent climb. The curves that avoided hard angles, swinging wide around ridge spurs rather than cutting through them. The shallow blasted cuts through granite where the original crews had worked the mountain into cooperation with patience and dynamite and hand drills over what must have been months. Someone had built this line with real craft and sustained intention. Someone had cared about getting it right. By mid-morning, she had climbed out of the valley and into the high country where the fir gave way to subalpine spruce, shorter and darker, their lower branches dead and dry in the mountain way. The trail narrowed where old slides had pushed debris across the grade, and nobody had cleared it in decades. She climbed over and around these obstacles steadily, without hurrying, resting when she needed to rest and not treating the need to rest as a failure of anything. She was aware in a way she had not expected of being alone. Not lonely. That was different. Lonely was the house in the evenings, the second chair at the kitchen table, the absence that had a specific shape because she knew every detail of what had once occupied it. This was something else. A solitude that was not empty but filled with the sound of her own footsteps and her own breathing, and the wind in the spruce and the distant sound of water somewhere below the grade. She found she did not mind it. She found moving further into it that she was beginning to understand what Rowan had meant by ready. The clouds came in from the northwest in the early afternoon. Mountain weather always arrived faster than it appeared to be moving when you first saw it building on the horizon. By the time she reached the trestle, the light had gone flat and gray, and the first serious gusts were coming down the canyon with a cold authority that left no room for optimism about what was coming. She stopped at the edge and looked out. The bridge stretched 200 feet across a river gorge she could not see the bottom of. Old timber, dark with decades of weather, the cross beams square-cut and massive, the iron spikes rusted into the wood so completely that the two materials had become a single substance over the years. The far end disappeared into gray that was pressing up the canyon from below with the purposeful advance of weather that has made up its mind. She could hear the river. She could not see it. The sensible thing was to wait. Find shelter on the near bank, let the weather pass cross in the morning with proper visibility. She knew this. She also knew that the clouds behind her had closed the valley in the last hour, and the temperature was dropping in steps, each step colder than the last, and that shelter on the near bank meant an exposed night in conditions that were moving towards Sirius. She stepped out onto the trestle. She moved the way she had learned to move in difficult clinical situations, which was with complete attention on each action before beginning the next one. She tested each tie before trusting her weight to it, feeling for the subtle give that meant rot had penetrated the wood. Most held. A few she stepped over. The old timber was harder and denser than she had expected, seasoned by mountain weather into something approaching stone. She was perhaps halfway across when the storm committed. The rain came sideways off the canyon wall, not building, but arriving all at once, fully formed and completely serious. The wind took it and drove it horizontal. In 30 seconds she was wet through her outer layer, and the visibility had dropped to 20 feet in any direction. She did the only practical thing. She got down low. She pressed herself flat against the ties, pulling her pack down with her, and tucked her face sideways against the wet wood and waited. The bridge moved under her, not dangerously, but perceptibly, the slight flex of a structure built to give without breaking. The river far below was no longer a sound she strained to hear. It filled the canyon like something breathing, like the canyon itself had a respiratory system and she was resting against its chest. She lay still and breathed and waited. It was in that stillness, with her face turned sideways against the wet timber and the rain hammering her back, that she saw it. Not immediately. It was not the kind of thing you saw immediately. First there was shadow between two of the heavy crossbeams, a patch of dark that was different from the other patches of dark. More regular. She turned her face slightly toward it and squinted through the rain. The shadow had edges that were too straight to be accidental. A corner. 2 corners. A shape that someone had made. She reached toward it. Her fingers found metal beneath the grit and lichen and decades of accumulated debris. Not just surface rust, but deep oxidation, the kind that happens when iron and moisture share an undisturbed relationship measured in decades. But beneath the oxidation, when she pressed harder, the surface was flat and machined. And when she ran her finger along the near edge, she found it a ring, recessed flush into the surface, hinged so it could be lifted. She got her fingers under it and pulled. Nothing. She adjusted her position, braced her shoulder against the adjacent beam, and pulled again with her whole upper body. Something shifted. Not much, but enough to know it was not sealed beyond recovery. She worked at it for what felt like a long time, the rain not stopping, the bridge continuing its patient movement in the wind. Her arms ached. She thought of the hip and the knees and the doctor's measured advice, and then she thought of Rowan's voice in the grey light of his last morning. "Don't open it until you're ready to walk alone." She pulled. The hatch opened with a sound like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time, finally releasing it. A long metallic protest against the rain and the wind, and then darkness beneath. She looked down. After a moment, with rain, light filtering from above, she could make out a ladder. Iron rungs set into actual rock, not into the bridge structure, but into a granite outcropping that jutted from the canyon wall into which someone had cut directly. The ladder descended perhaps 15 feet before it met a surface she could not quite resolve from above. A floor, level and deliberate. She thought about what a reasonable person would do. A reasonable person would not climb down an unknown ladder into a hole in a rock on a trestle bridge in the middle of a mountain storm, in a place where nobody knew she was. She considered this assessment for approximately 4 seconds. Then she got her boots over the edge and found the first rung. It held. Old iron deep in the stone. The second rung held. She pulled the hatch most of the way down over her head as she descended, not sealing it, leaving a gap for what thin grey light remained. The darkness came up around her with each step, and the storm above became muffled, theoretical, separated from her by iron and wood, and then by stone. The river remained. She could feel it more than hear it moving through the rock itself, a low frequency that lived in the stone, and therefore lived in her hands and feet where they contacted it. Her boots found the floor. She stood very still. She gave her eyes the time they needed, which was longer than she would have liked, but less than she feared. The darkness was not total. A seam of pale grey light came from somewhere ahead, thin as a knife blade, enough to give the dark a shape. She could make out the floor, pale stone cut close to level. Walls pressing close on both sides, rough stone with chisel marks still visible in the rock. A ceiling just clearing her head by a few inches. She did not move yet. She stood and breathed and listened. No dripping except from her own jacket. No wind. The storm was above her, behind the iron and the ties and the rails, and it felt like something happening in another world now. The river was still present, but changed no longer. Weather, just the permanent sound of water doing what water has always done, patient and continuous, and somehow in this stone room below this forgotten bridge reassuring. She took one step forward. The passage opened. She felt it before she saw it, the close pressure of the walls falling away on both sides, and she understood she had moved from a corridor into a room. Her outstretched hand found a wall, and she moved along it, and her fingers found a shelf. On the shelf, her knuckles knocked against something solid that skittered and almost fell. She caught it, a candle in a glass jar. She felt along the shelf carefully and found what she was hoping for, a small cardboard box of matches, slightly damp on the outside but not through. She took her time with the first match, sheltering the small flame in the cup of both hands. She touched it to the wick. The room came up around her. It was not large. Perhaps 12 feet by 14, the low ceiling continuing overhead, except at the center where someone had chipped the rock upward to create a vault just enough to stand fully upright. The walls were natural canyon stone, but things had been done to them. Shelves cut directly from the rock and supplemented with rough timber planking bolted into drilled holes. A cast-iron wood stove against the far wall, its pipe disappearing upward into a channel bored through the stone toward some crevice in the canyon wall where smoke could escape unseen. Beside the stove, split wood stacked dry as chalk. On the shelves, cans sealed with wax glass jars with rubber gasketed lids, folded cloth tools arranged in order of size on a strip of pegboard. At the far wall, almost invisible until she moved the candle, a window. Narrow, horizontal cut from the stone like an embrasure in an old fort. She moved toward it slowly, her shadow going large against the ancient rock behind her. She pressed her face to the narrow gap. Far below, 200 feet down the sheer canyon wall, the river ran green and pale through the last gray light of the storm. White foam where it broke around boulders. Cottonwoods bent along the near bank, their last leaves trembling. The sound she had assumed was wind had been the river all along. It was the sound the whole place breathed. She stood there for a long moment. Then she turned back to the room and began systematically to look at what was here. She moved along the shelves from left to right, noting without yet touching. Cans, jars, folded blankets dry and intact when she shook them out. A first aid kit in a tin box, a coil of good rope. Under the workbench, a wooden crate. She pulled it out and opened it. Mason jars packed in straw green beans. Corn beets, peaches and syrup still holding color. Whoever had put these up had known what they were doing. No swollen seals, no rust under the rings. She found the box under the dry goods in the second crate. Set flat against the crate bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. She sat on the floor with it across her knees and worked the knot loose. Inside the oilcloth was a wooden box, roughly the size of a Bible. The lid fit with the precision of good joinery. Inside were papers. She held the candle close. The top sheet was a hand-drawn diagram. The bridge the canyon, a cross-section of the rock face showing the cavity and profile. Measurements noted with an engineer's precision. She recognized the draftsmanship. She had seen it on the sketches Rowan made when he was working out a problem on the drawings he made of the house addition they had never gotten around to building, on the small, careful diagrams he drew on napkins in restaurants when he was trying to explain something he cared about. She held the paper in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Below the main diagram were smaller sketches. The hatch mechanism, the chimney channel, the window frame. This was not rough field work. This was a record made after construction documenting what had been built for someone who was not yet there. She set the plans aside. The next sheet was a list. Towns written in a different hand from the draftsmanship, pressed harder into the paper, the letters less even. Some towns she recognized, some she did not. Each had either a check mark or a line struck through it. No obvious geographic logic to the distribution. The marks and lines were spread deliberately, as if someone had been moving through a territory in a pattern designed to avoid repetition, to avoid being noticed. She read the list twice without understanding it. Then she found the photograph at the bottom of the box. Black and white, edges curled. She held it close to the candle and looked at it with the full attention she gave things that mattered, the complete look rather than the glancing one. Two men standing on this bridge. The canyon visible behind them. One man looking at the camera. The other looking out at the canyon, watching for something, or simply watching, she could not tell which. She turned the photograph over. The inscription on the back was in handwriting she had known for 43 years. Rowan's hand, certain and clear, written without hesitation. Rowan and Decker, spring 1999. She turned the photograph back over. The man looking at the camera was her husband. She could see him in the set of his shoulders, the slight forward lean that was just Rowan's way of standing, as if he was perpetually about to say something he was still choosing the right words for. Younger here than she had known him in the later years, but unmistakably him. The other man, the one looking out at the canyon, was 27 years old in this photograph. She was seeing him as he had been 2 years before he disappeared. He was taller than she had kept him in her memory, or perhaps the canyon behind him gave him a scale she had not had access to in the photographs she kept at home. He had Rowan's way of carrying his shoulders. She had not known they had come here together. She had not known this place existed. She had been married to Rowan for 43 years, and she had not known. Decker had been missing for 21 years. He had been 29 when it happened. He would have been 50 this spring. She sat with the photograph in her hands and the candle burning in its jar and the river making its permanent sound through the stone around her, and she did not cry. She had done her crying. She had done it in the months after Decker disappeared, and then again in a different key in the years after, when hope became something she carried more quietly. She had done it again when Rowan died, a grief that was its own thing, and also underneath the reopening of the other grief that had never fully closed. She was not crying now because crying was not what the moment required. What the moment required was attention. She opened her notebook and uncapped her pen and wrote the date at the top of the first clean page. Below it she wrote what she knew in order: observation before interpretation, facts before conclusions. The room exists. Rowan built it. Decker was here with him in 1999. She wrote the town names from the list, leaving space beside each for notes she could not yet write. She sketched the layout of the room. She noted the food stores, the tools, the condition of everything. Then at the bottom of the page she wrote the question she could not yet answer. Why didn't he tell me? She looked at the question for a moment. Then she capped the pen and put the notebook back in her pocket and looked around the room again with the candle burning its last half-inch of wax. She pulled a blanket from the shelf and wrapped it around her shoulders and sat in the chair beside the workbench. The candle went out sometime later on its own, the wax pooled and the wick gone, and she sat in the dark that was not quite total because of the narrow window and the thin grey remaining light of the storm. She did not sleep. She sat with the photograph in her hands and thought about what it meant to know a person for 43 years and discover you had not known everything. She thought about whether not knowing everything was the same as not knowing them. She thought about Rowan's voice in the early morning of his last day, the thin certainty of it. Don't open it until you're ready to walk alone. He had known she would come here. He had given her the key, the actual iron key now in her jacket pocket, the one that had opened the hatch. He had wanted her to find this. He had wanted her to find it, but had not been able to tell her why while he was alive. He had been afraid or ashamed or both. She had known him well enough to understand that certain things were impossible for him to say directly, and that this was not a flaw she had failed to correct, but a truth she had accepted because love is in part the practice of accepting the specific shape of another person rather than the shape you might have preferred. The river kept moving below her. The storm kept moving above. The room stayed exactly as it was. She reached into her jacket pocket and felt the iron key between her fingers. Heavy, heavier than it looked, made to last. She held it in her palm in the dark and waited for the morning. The light came in through the narrow window, the way light comes through stone. Slowly, having spent something of itself getting through the rock, arriving with less than it started with. Grey first, then pale yellow, which meant the storm had broken in the night, and the sun was somewhere above the canyon walls, not yet high enough to reach the gorge floor, but present announced. Etty had not slept. She had sat in the chair through the full dark and the slow lightning, and she had not slept, but she was not tired in the way she had expected. She was something else. Alert in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine or urgency and everything to do with the particular clarity that arrives when the mind has been working steadily through the night on something important and has not wasted itself on anything else. She stood. Her body registered the night in the chair, the hip, the left knee, the stiffness across her shoulders from holding herself still for too long. She moved through it the way she had always moved through physical discomfort, by acknowledging it without entering into negotiation with it. You noted what hurt. You did not argue with it. You moved anyway. She went to the window first. In the early morning light, the river was visible for the first time. Narrow and fast pale green where it caught the sky threading between dark boulders 60 or 70 feet below. The canyon walls on the far side were dense with old-growth spruce and pine, the kind of timber that had been left alone long enough to develop its own interior climate distinct from the world above. She studied the ridgeline above it, trying to match what she saw against the hand-drawn map from the wooden box. She opened her notebook to the sketch she had made from memory. The dotted trail, if the proportions held, began somewhere near the waterline below the bridge and climbed northeast along the east bank before bending inland and up a low shelf above the river. Not far on paper. Paper never accounted for terrain, for the way a hillside that looked gentle from a distance turned specific and demanding the moment you were on it. But she wanted to know what was marked at the end of that dotted line. She built a small fire in the stove first. She found a bird's nest wedged 3 feet up the flue pipe within the first minute, dry materials packed with the thoroughness small creatures bring to shelter making. She cleared it with a length of wire from the pegboard and tested the drawer with birch bark from the wood box. The smoke went up clean. The chimney channel performed exactly as Rowan had designed it. She held her hands near the small flame and let the warmth reach her. Then she did what she had been trained to do in any situation requiring clear thinking. She ate something. She drank water. She changed into the dry shirt rolled at the bottom of her pack. Small acts of maintenance performed not from comfort-seeking but from the practical understanding that a body that is cold and hungry and in wet clothes makes poor decisions, and she could not afford poor decisions here. She spent the early morning being useful. She inventoried the food stores properly, using the notebook to log each item and note which cans showed rust along the seams and should be used first. She examined the tools more carefully in daylight. She found a narrow drawer under the workbench flush with the wood, no handle that she worked open with a flathead screwdriver from the tool rack. Inside 3 keys on a plain ring, a stub of pencil worn nearly to the ferrule, and a folded piece of oilcloth. She unfolded it. A hand-drawn map of the canyon itself. The river, the ridgeline. A dotted trail climbing from the riverbank to a point north of the bridge where someone had drawn a small square and written 2 letters. DV. She went very still with the map in her hands. Decker Vaughn. His initials. His marker on what the map pointed to. The way you mark something that belongs to you, or something you have decided to belong to. She added the initials to her notebook. She copied the map carefully, checking proportions twice. She folded both maps and put them in separate pockets. If she lost one, she would have the other. She climbed the ladder at mid-morning. The bridge was entirely different in daylight. She could see through gaps in the planking to the river 60 feet below, green and fast and continuous. She moved along the ties with the same care as the night before, but with the added information of being able to see where she was placing her feet, which made the care feel less like caution and more like competence. At the eastern end of the trestle, she found the trailhead, where a narrow footpath dropped away through the brush into the canyon. She knew immediately it was not a game trail. The width was too uniform and deliberate, and the ground was packed in a way that spoke of repeated use over years rather than the random passage of animals. Someone had walked this route many times in all weather without calling attention to the fact. She followed it down. The path switchbacked twice through dense spruce before leveling along the riverbank where the water ran wide and shallow over a gravel bar. The canyon walls here were pale granite, shot through with seams of quartz that caught the morning light and briefly held it the way certain things hold light, not generating it but gathering it from elsewhere, and returning it changed. She oriented herself against the copied map, found the river bend, found the rough triangle of ridge above the bridge. The dotted line ran north along the east bank. She followed it. After 20 minutes, the trail bent inland and climbed a low shelf above the waterline. The vegetation changed here, thinner trees, more light reaching the ground. And then she stopped. There was a clearing that should not exist. She understood this immediately, the way you understand things that are out of place in a natural landscape when you have spent enough time paying attention to natural landscapes. The spruce had been cut back decades ago. The stumps had rotted nearly flat, but the clearing remained open. 12 raised beds arranged in 2 parallel rows built from logs that had long since silvered and sunk partly into the earth. The structure was still present. The spacing was logical. The orientation was south-facing, positioned to catch maximum light through the narrow canyon window placed by someone who had understood both agriculture and this specific canyon's particular way of admitting sun. Someone had farmed here. Someone had tended this ground over multiple seasons with care and consistency. She walked the rows slowly. The soil in the beds was darker than the surrounding ground, still rich-looking despite years of neglect. She crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the nearest bed. The earth gave with a texture that spoke of amendment, of compost worked in over time, of sustained attention. This had not been a single season's experiment. She thought of Decker. He had been a quiet boy, methodical in the way Rowan was methodical, interested in how things worked and how things grew. He had kept a garden on his apartment balcony in Missoula for 3 years before he moved to the field work. She had teased him about it once. He had told her seriously, the way he told most things, that growing something was the most honest conversation you could have with a place. You put in what the place needed, and the place told you whether you had understood it correctly. She had not thought of that in many years. Along the far edge of the clearing, she found the small square from the map. A low structure barely visible beneath brush, and a birch tree that had grown up through the corner of it over the intervening years. A cache shed. The roof had fallen in on one side, but the walls were standing flat stones mortared with clay, the whole thing no larger than a garden shed. The door was a single plank on hand-forged hinges, swollen shut with moisture and time. She worked it open with her shoulder. Inside, shelves along two walls, mostly empty. A rusted hand cultivator on a nail, two ceramic crocks sealed with wax-dipped cloth, and on the highest shelf a small tin box with a hasp latch. She reached for the tin box and stopped herself. The crocks had been sealed with care, and that care deserved equal attention. She lifted the nearest one and worked her thumbnail under the cloth. The wax gave in flakes. Beneath it, the surface was dark amber, thick, still holding color under a thin crystallized layer. She pressed a fingertip to it and tasted carefully. Plum. Intensely sweet, slightly fermented from the years, but not spoiled. Still food. She set it in the doorway in the morning light and turned to the tin box. The hasp was stiff but not locked. She worked it open and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, gone brittle at the edges, was a bundle. She unfolded it one corner at a time. Seed packets, a dozen hand-labeled in the same penciled cursive as the canyon map. Plum tomato, pole bean, winter squash, sweet corn, dill, calendula. She set them side by side on the oilcloth and looked at them. Below the packets, folded twice a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it. The handwriting was not Rowan's. She knew this immediately, knew it in her body before her mind had processed it, the way you know things you have learned to recognize across decades of close attention. Rowan wrote with an engineer's precision, his letters upright and evenly spaced. This handwriting pressed harder into the page, the letters less even the pen bearing down, as if the act of writing was itself an effort. She had seen this handwriting before on birthday cards and the occasional letter, and once on a note left on her kitchen counter that she had saved in the small cedar box where she kept such things. It was Decker's handwriting. She stood in the doorway with the paper in both hands, and the morning light coming even and clear through the open door. And she read. It was not a letter exactly. It was a list and inventory written for someone who was not yet there. It described the room under the bridge, the garden beds, the stone shed, what had been built, and where. It noted the stove damper that ran stiff in cold weather and required a second hand to seat properly. It said the south garden bed drained poorly in spring and would need the drainage channel extended another 4 feet toward the slope. It mentioned that the wall nearest the river window sometimes wept moisture in heavy rain and needed its clay and sand packing refreshed every few years. She read these practical notes the way she might read the handover notes from a colleague at the end of a long shift. Thorough, specific, written by someone who expected them to be useful. Then she came to the last line. It had been added separately, the pen pressed harder, the words sitting apart from everything above them, the way certain sentences sit apart because they are carrying more weight than sentences usually carry. If you found this, you were looking. That's enough. She read it 3 times. She folded the paper along its original creases and stood very still in the doorway with it in her hands. The canyon was quiet around her. A pair of Clark's nutcrackers crossed the clearing in a long diagonal arc and disappeared into the spruce. The river made its permanent sound in the gorge below. She was 71 years old, and her son had left a note in a stone shed in a Montana canyon, telling whoever found it that the act of looking was sufficient, that the looking itself was enough. She understood in a way she had not understood the night before that he had written this for her specifically, not knowing it was for her, not knowing she would be the one to come, but writing it for the person who would come, and that person was her. And he had always known without knowing he knew that the person who would come would be someone who was looking rather than someone who had simply stumbled through. She set the paper down on the shelf beside the seed packets and sat on the stone ledge outside the shed and let the morning move around her. After a time, she opened her notebook and began to write what she had found. Documented facts, first clearly separated from interpretation in the order she had been trained to document them. She had been writing for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard the voices, distant above her, coming from the direction of the bridge. She stopped writing and held very still. In a canyon, this shape sound traveled in ways that were not always predictable. She had worked enough rural cases in her nursing years to know that acoustic geography was its own discipline. What she was hearing was coming from above and to the north, which meant from the bridge or from the trail approaching it. She capped her pen. She put the notebook in her jacket. She moved to the tree line at the edge of the clearing and stood where she would not be visible from above. 2 men appeared on the trestle. She could see them through the spruce fragments of movement between the bridge uprights, resolving into figures when they stopped near the middle of the span. One carried a document case. The other was older, heavier, in a coat that was too good for this terrain. The kind of coat that announced the person wearing it did not expect the terrain to be difficult. She watched and she listened. Sound traveled in the canyon. She caught fragments at first, words arriving in pieces through the wind. Then the wind dropped for a period, and the river settled into its lower register, and she caught something that was not a fragment. The older man said, "The Vaughn boy left something on this line. 20 years, and nobody found it. We find it now before the preservation filing goes through." She did not move. The younger man said something she could not fully hear. The older man answered more clearly. He said, 11 days. After the filing, the corridor goes into historical review and we lose access entirely. Everything on the line gets frozen. Then check the trestle structure. If there's a hatch or access point, he would have used it. He was an engineer's kid. He thought like an engineer. The 2 men moved along the bridge slowly. She watched them through the tree line. The older one, the one in the good coat, moved with the care of someone unaccustomed to this surface. The younger one moved with the efficiency of someone doing a job he had done in many contexts before. They did not find the hatch. From above, walking on the ties, looking down through the gaps in the planking, it was invisible. She had found it only because she had been pressed flat against the ties in the dark, with her face at the level of the crossbeam. She watched them reach the far end of the trestle confer briefly and turn back. The older man stopped near the center of the bridge again. He looked out at the canyon. He said something to the younger man she could not hear. Then he said clearly, with the particular weight of someone who has been managing something for a very long time and has grown tired of managing it. 21 years is a long time to keep a file open. The younger man said something. The older man said, "It stays open until we find what he collected." That was the arrangement. That was always the arrangement. They moved off the bridge. The canyon went quiet. She stayed in the tree line for another 10 minutes after the sound of their footsteps had gone. She counted the time on her watch. Then she walked back to the shed and sat on the ledge and opened her notebook. She wrote, 2 men. Trestle, approximately 10:40 a.m. Older man, gray coat, document case, authority. Posture. Younger man, field clothes, working role. Discussion filing deadline, 11 days preservation status. Vaughn. Stonemark Land Corp, embossed on document case, visible at 40 feet when man turned. She wrote Stonemark Land Corp in capital letters and drew a line under it. She went back into the stone shed and looked at the town list again. Looked at it with the eyes she had now, rather than the eyes she had brought yesterday. The check marks and cross-outs that had seemed to have no geographic logic had a logic she could see now. Someone moving through a territory in a pattern designed not to form a visible pattern. Moving between towns that appeared unrelated. Staying long enough to document, not long enough to be noticed. Decker had been collecting something. Town by town along the route of a decommissioned railroad corridor that a company called Stonemark was now trying to acquire before a preservation filing closed the window. 21 years, the man had said. 21 years, and the file stayed open. She needed to find the composition notebook she now understood must exist somewhere in this canyon. Decker had left operational instructions in the tin box. He had left a map in the drawer. He had marked his initials on the destination. He would not have left the core of what he had collected without a specific protected location. She looked at the shed with new eyes, not at its contents, but at its structure. She ran her hands along the walls at shelf height, stone and mortar. She moved to the back wall where the light was thinnest. She pressed each stone in the back right section in turn, working methodically left to right from the floor up. The third stone from the floor in the far right corner moved. Not much. A fraction of an inch. But enough. She worked around it with the flathead screwdriver pressing along the mortar joints. The mortar here was slightly darker than the rest applied more recently. She removed the stone. It was heavy, perhaps 12 pounds, and came out cleanly. Behind it was a cavity, roughly the size of a shoebox. Inside the cavity was an oilskin packet wrapped and tied. Her hands were very steady when she untied it. Inside the oilskin was a composition notebook. The cardboard cover, hard and worn, the spine intact, nothing on the cover. She opened it. Decker's handwriting. Dense and close, covering every page, dates and locations and names and numbers and amounts. The same hand as the tin box letter, but working faster here under more pressure. The letters still controlled, but the pressure behind them different. This was documentation made in real time by someone who understood that time was a variable he could not fully control. The first entry was dated June 4th, 1999. She read, Decker had begun that summer to notice irregularities in the land transfer records for parcels along the Cutter Pass corridor. He was doing field survey work for a private contractor working territory she had known he was in without knowing the specific focus of his work. The irregularities were subtle. Ownership records with gaps in the chain of title. Transfer documents referencing court orders that did not appear in the public record. A pattern that became visible only when you looked at the parcels together across the full corridor rather than examining each one in isolation. He wrote, Each parcel on its own looks like a normal distressed property acquisition. Delinquent taxes, absentee owner, straightforward court process. You look at 20 of them in sequence and the process stops being straightforward. The timing is too regular. The court orders are coming out of the same district, same judge at intervals that don't match normal case processing. Someone is managing this. He wrote, The corridor has value. Not for what's on it. The value is in what it connects. Eastern access to the high country federal grazing land. If someone acquires a controlling interest in the corridor, they control the access. The grazing permits become dependent on corridor access. The economics are significant. He wrote the name Stonemark for the first time in an entry from August 1999. He had traced 3 irregular transfer documents to a holding company that traced through 2 shell layers to Stonemark Land Corp. Out of Denver. She read through the summer and fall of 1999 and into 2000. Decker had been careful, systematic, thorough. He had built a case the way cases are built properly, from documented facts with sources named and cross-referenced, with a clear and unbroken chain of evidence connecting each claim to the record supporting it. By the spring of 2001, he had documented 37 parcel transfers. He had identified the district judge. He had found the connection between Stonemark and a campaign contribution to that judge's original election in 1994. He had found the names of 2 men in Stonemark's legal department appearing on internal correspondence obtained through a contact he did not name. One of those names was Calloway. She stopped. She read the sentence again. Then she read the full paragraph. The senior legal counsel at Stonemark handling the corridor acquisitions is listed in state bar records as Pruitt Calloway, admitted 1988, Denver office. He appears on 3 of the correspondence documents my contact provided. He is the operational center of this. He designed the filing structure. He is the one who would know if the structure is found. She sat with this for a moment. The older man on the bridge. Gray coat. The voice that carried the ease of someone accustomed to being the person in the room who was obeyed. She wrote the name in her notebook in capital letters. Pruitt Calloway. She returned to Decker's notebook. The last entry was dated September the 3rd, 2001, 18 days before he was reported missing. The handwriting the same controlled pressure as the rest, but the sentences shorter, tighter. He wrote, They know someone has been collecting. My contact is gone. I haven't been able to reach him in 3 weeks. I found a car at the trailhead twice this week that wasn't there when I went up and wasn't there when I came back. Someone is watching the access points. They don't know it's me yet, but they're close. He wrote, I have to get this to Helena. The U.S. Attorney's Office, not the state. State channels are too close to the district judge. Federal only. I have a name from my contact, an attorney in the federal office who is not connected to any of this. I'm going in person. No mail, no phone. He wrote, if I don't come back, it's in the wall. Third stone from the floor, back right corner. She'll know what to do with it. She read the word again. He had not written a name. He had not needed to. He had written she the way you write the name of the only person in your life, for whom that pronoun is sufficient, the only person so entirely known to you that they require no further specification. She was 71 years old, and her son had left a notebook in a stone wall in a Montana canyon because he had believed without reservation that she would know what to do with it. She closed the notebook. She wrapped it back in its oilskin and put it in the inner chest pocket of her jacket against her body, where it would stay dry, regardless of what the weather did. She replaced the stone and repacked the mortar with the care she had found it packed with. Then she went back to the room beneath the bridge, built a small fire in the stove, and sat down to think about what came next. 11 days. The preservation filing. 37 documented parcel transfers. One name, Pruitt Calloway. She was a 71-year-old woman with bad knees and a left hip that complained in cold weather. She was also a woman who had spent 31 years documenting things accurately, under conditions that did not favor accuracy, who had been trained to observe without distorting and to remember without embellishing, who had sat with people in their worst moments and helped them navigate toward whatever resolution was available. She thought about Decker's last words in the notebook. She'll know what to do with it. She opened her notebook to a fresh page, and at the top she wrote, what needs to happen. Below that, she began to write a list, methodical, complete each step, supporting the next. She had not finished the list when she heard the sound she had been waiting for without knowing she had been waiting for it. The hatch opening above her. She did not go to the ladder when she heard the hatch. She stayed at the workbench, and she set her pen down, and she sat with her hands in her lap. And she waited the way she had learned to wait for things that were coming regardless of whether you were ready. There was a small fire in the stove. The candle on the workbench was lit. The room was warmer than it had been when she arrived, and cleaner are the surfaces she had worked over the past 2 days, having the particular quality of order that comes when someone has been paying attention to a space rather than merely occupying it. She heard the footsteps on the iron rungs. Careful footsteps, not practiced, the footsteps of someone who had found the hatch but had not used it before. She heard the change when the boots reached the stone floor of the passage, and then the footsteps in the passage itself, and then the moment when the passage opened into the room. Pruitt Calloway stood in the entrance with a flashlight and looked at her. She looked back at him. He was perhaps 60, perhaps a few years older. Today he was in field clothes which told her he had come prepared for this, had returned to the bridge with intention rather than stumbling back to it. The flashlight was expensive, the kind that produces a beam you could read by. He held it pointed at the floor between them rather than at her face, which she noted as a piece of social intelligence in a man who was otherwise. She suspected not especially concerned with other people's comfort. He said, "You're not a hiker." She said no. He moved the flashlight slightly, taking in the room. He was assessing, not yet searching. He had not decided what to do, and he was gathering information before deciding which was what intelligent people did in situations they had not fully anticipated. He said, "You've been here a while." She said, "A few days." He said, "This is private property." The corridor was acquired under a territorial court order in. She said, "The corridor is under a preservation filing review, which you know. That's why you're here with 11 days on your clock." He went still. She watched him recalibrate. He was a man who was accustomed to being the person in any room who held the most information. He had just discovered that this was not that kind of room. He said, "Who are you?" She said, "My name is Etty Vaughn." The name landed in the room the way certain things land, not dramatically, but with the weight of something that has been expected for a very long time and has finally arrived. She watched it land on him. She watched the recalibration happen again, faster this time and less complete. He said, "Decker Vaughn's mother." She said, "Yes." Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly. Something more like the expression of a man who has been managing a complex problem for a long time and has just discovered that the problem has acquired a dimension he did not account for. He said, "Mrs. Vaughn, I understand you've experienced a significant loss, and I want to assure you that the situation involving your son was handled through legitimate legal channels. There was a process." She said, "Tell me what happened to my son." He stopped. She said it again, the same tone, the same unhurried certainty. Not aggressive, not soft, simply clear and patient and completely certain that she would wait as long as it took. He said, "Your son made some incorrect assumptions about certain land transactions in this corridor." He gathered materials that he believed supported those assumptions. He intended to take those materials to federal authorities, which would have created unnecessary complications for a legitimate business operation. He was approached by representatives of our organization and offered the opportunity to discuss his concerns through appropriate channels. She said, and instead, he disappeared. He said, he was given an offer. Certain assurances. We have no knowledge of his subsequent. She reached into her jacket pocket and placed Decker's composition notebook on the workbench beside the candle. He stopped talking. She said, "My son documented 37 fraudulent land transfers. He documented the campaign contribution to the district judge. He documented 2 members of Stonemark's legal department by name. He documented your name, Mr. Calloway, 3 times, with specific context each time. I have read all of it. I have copied all of it into my own notebook. The original is stored in a location in this canyon that you have not found and will not find. I have made a second set of copies. Those are not in this canyon." She watched him process this. She reached into her jacket again and placed Rowan's letter on the workbench beside the notebook. She said, "My husband also left me a letter. He had kept a secret for 19 years. Toward the end of his life, he wrote it down. I'd like you to read the relevant paragraph." She did not offer the letter to him. She opened it to the paragraph she meant and turned it so he could read it from where he stood. She watched his eyes move across the lines. She watched them stop on a specific phrase. She watched what happened to his face when they stopped. The phrase was the permanence could be extended to others. He said slowly, the careful phrasing of a man who has just realized he is in a room where the floor is less solid than it appeared. Your husband was misinformed about the nature of what was communicated to him. She said, he wrote down what was communicated to him. He said, there was nothing that was said to your husband was intended as a, she said, Mr. Calloway. My husband kept a secret for 19 years because someone came to our house and told him the consequences of not keeping it would extend to people he loved. He kept that secret until he was too sick to keep it any longer, and then he left me the means to find out what it was. He was afraid for 19 years. I want you to understand what that costs a person. He was quiet. She let the quiet sit in the room. She had learned a long time ago that silence in a difficult conversation was not a void that needed filling. It was a space that allowed the weight of what had already been said to settle to its proper depth. He said finally, the voice lower now and with the quality of something that has been rehearsed for a long time and is now being set aside because rehearsal is no longer adequate. We didn't kill him. She said, say that again. He said, your son. We didn't. He's alive, Mrs. Vaughn. What happened in 2001 was he was approached. He was given terms. He was told that if he left the state and stayed out of this matter, his family would not be involved. He accepted those terms. He has honored them. She sat with this information and held it at the point of entry and examined it before she allowed it to proceed, because this was a man with a significant interest in what she believed. Because a living Decker who had chosen silence was a situation Calloway could manage. A dead Decker could not be managed in the same way. But she also thought about Rowan's letter. Nothing that was said to your husband was intended as a threat to his son's life. Rowan had believed Decker was dead. If Decker had truly been alive and simply gone, the man who came to their house in 2003 would have said so. He had not said so. He had let Rowan believe what Rowan feared. That was a specific choice made for a specific reason. She said, "You told a 29-year-old man that if he stayed gone, his mother would be safe." He did not answer directly. She said, "You let his father believe he was dead for 19 years. You let us bury him in our minds because a man who is presumed dead does not have a family who keeps asking questions." The room was very quiet. He said, "The terms were meant to be protective of everyone involved." She said, "I'm sure you told yourself that. I'm sure you still do." She stood up from the chair. She said, "Here is what is going to happen. I have been in this canyon for 3 days. I have read everything my son collected. I have read everything my husband assembled in the 21 years after my son disappeared. The originals are in secured locations. There is a safety deposit box in Helena registered in my name containing additional documentation my husband compiled. I am going to Helena to retrieve it. I am going to the U.S. Attorney's office with a name I was given in this notebook, and I intend to use it." She picked up her pack and settled it on her shoulders. She said, "I also want you to understand something about your situation that you may not have fully considered when you came down that ladder. I was a nurse for 31 years. In that time, I documented patient conversations under conditions that made accuracy genuinely difficult, and I testified to that documentation 4 times in legal proceedings under cross-examination. I remember with complete accuracy what you said on this bridge 2 days ago. I remember the time, the content, and the sequence of what you have said in this room in the last 15 minutes. I have committed it to memory in the order it occurred with the context of each statement. I do not need a recording device, Mr. Calloway. I am a recording device. And I want you to think about what that means for the conversation you just had with me." She moved to the passage entrance. She said without turning around, "My son left a note in the stone shed. He said if you found this you were looking, and that's enough. He wrote it for whoever came, but he wrote she. He didn't write a name, but he wrote she, which means he always knew who was going to come. I found what he left. That is going to be enough." She went into the passage and climbed the ladder. The bridge was cold and clear in the morning air, the timber gray and glistening with dew. The canyon below still in shadow, while the sky above was fully light. She walked the ties with steady feet, testing each one, the pack on her shoulders and the notebook in her chest pocket and Rowan's letter folded against her heart. She did not look back. She walked for 3 hours before she reached the trailhead, where she had left her truck behind the old station building in Belden, undisturbed. She put the pack in the bed and sat in the driver's seat for a moment, with the door open and the morning air coming in from the hills she had just come down from. She had one more thing to find before Helena. She drove to the First Territorial Bank in Belden, not the Helena branch Rowan had mentioned in the letter. She found the number for the Helena branch and called from the bank's lobby phone. She gave her full name, Elspeth Cale Vaughan, the name that appeared on her nursing license, and her marriage certificate. The name Rowan had registered the safety deposit box under, and she confirmed that the box existed and that she was the registered holder and that she would be coming in person that afternoon. The woman on the phone confirmed the box. Safety deposit box number 114, registered 2004 E. Cale Vaughan, active account in good standing. Rowan had opened it in 2004, 3 years after Decker disappeared, 1 year after the man came to their house. She thanked the woman and drove to Helena. The U.S. Attorney's office was on the 4th floor of the federal building on Neal Avenue. She found Gideon Marsh's name in the directory on the 1st floor, Senior Assistant U.S. Attorney, and she took the stairs because she had never had any patience for elevators and did not intend to develop it now. She told the receptionist her name and said she had documentation relevant to a land fraud matter in the Cutter Pass corridor, and that she understood the office might have a long-standing interest in this matter, and that she would like to speak with someone who had the authority to begin a formal intake process. She was shown to a conference room. She sat at the table with her notebook open in front of her and her pack on the chair beside her, and she waited with the patience of someone who has waited in much harder conditions for much higher stakes. The door opened. The man who came in was in his late 50s, thin, with the quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent a long time in rooms where careful listening was the most important skill available. He sat across the table from her and gave his name and title and asked how he could help her. She said, "My name is Etty Vaughn. My son is Decker Vaughn. I believe you may have a file." He went very still. She said, "I have documentation. I have the original secured in the field in copies on my person. I have a second set in a safety deposit box at First Territorial in Helena, registered in my name. I can describe the complete chain of custody for all of it. I can testify to a conversation I witnessed 2 days ago between a Stonemark Land Corp representative named Pruitt Calloway and an associate, and I can testify to a subsequent conversation between myself and Calloway. And I remember both conversations in their complete sequence with full accuracy." She paused. She said, "I also have reason to believe my son may be alive, and I would like to address that matter as well in whatever order is most useful to you." Gideon Marsh looked at her for a moment. The quality of stillness in him deepened in a particular way that she had seen before in people who had been waiting for something for a very long time and had finally stopped waiting. He opened the folder he had brought into the room and took out a pen. He said, "Mrs. Vaughn, I'd like you to start from the beginning. She said I have time." She began. She told it in order. From the envelope on the kitchen table, to the morning on the bridge, to the room beneath the trestle, to the stone shed and its contents, to the wall cavity and Rowan's letter, and the conversation on the bridge and the conversation in the room. She told it the way she had been trained to tell difficult things clearly in sequence observation before interpretation. Facts before conclusions, without embellishment and without omission. She told it with the composed precision of a woman who had spent 31 years making herself trustworthy in exactly this way, in exactly this kind of room with exactly this kind of stakes. When she finished, Gideon Marsh looked at his notes. Then he looked at her. He said, "The Cutter Pass file has been open in this office since 2002. We received an anonymous tip that year suggesting someone had been collecting documentation on the corridor acquisitions. The source was never identified. The documentation never surfaced. We've been waiting for it to surface for 21 years. He said it simply without drama, the way you say things that have cost you something over a long time." She reached into her chest pocket and placed her notebook on the table between them. She said, "It surfaced." Marsh called in 2 other attorneys and a paralegal, and the intake process began. She answered questions for 4 hours. She was precise about what she had seen and heard and read, and what she had copied versus what she was working from memory. She distinguished clearly between documented fact and inference, between what she had witnessed directly and what she had been told. She was throughout the most reliable witness she knew how to be, which was very reliable indeed. At the end of the 4th hour, she asked about the safety deposit box, and Marsh arranged for a federal evidence officer to accompany her to the bank. The box held as Rowan's letter had promised a complete copy of Decker's documentation made in Rowan's own hand, updated twice over 21 years as new information became available, the last update, dated 2019. Rowan had been thorough. He had been meticulous. He had spent 21 years in silence, and had spent those years documenting everything he could document, building the record. He was too afraid to submit, waiting for the day he could pass it to someone who was not afraid. The copies he had made were in some ways more complete than Decker's originals, because Rowan had had 2 decades to track what Stonemark had done after 2001, and the record of those 2 additional decades was significant. She thought about what it must have cost him to sit with it that long. She thought about what it meant that the final thing he had done with it was give her the key. The federal injunction suspending Stonemark Land Corp's acquisition of the Cutter Pass corridor was issued 8 days later, 2 days before the preservation filing deadline. The injunction was based on documentary evidence of fraudulent land transfers affecting 37 parcels, supplemented by the testimony of a witness whose recall of 2 separate conversations was deemed in the formal language of the proceeding exceptional and reliable. Pruitt Calloway was named in the indictment that followed. He entered into a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office, providing the names of the district judge, the 2 senior Stonemark executives who had authorized the original scheme, and 3 other attorneys who had participated in the filing fraud over the years. In exchange for his cooperation, he received a reduced charge and a sentencing recommendation the office declined to discuss publicly. The district judge resigned before the indictment was unsealed. The Cutter Pass spur was added to the National Register of Historic Places the following spring. The corridor, in the language of the register, was noted for its engineering significance and for the evidence it contained of sustained human habitation and agricultural use in a remote mountain environment, the specific nature of which the register declined to detail. The matter of Decker Vaughn took longer. Marsh's office located him through a process they declined to describe in detail, which she respected. He had been living in a small town in northern Idaho for 20 years under the name David Kane. A name he had chosen, as he later told her, because it was plain and unmemorable, and because the initials were his own, which was the only piece of himself he had not been willing to give up entirely. He was 50 years old. He had a small house with a large garden. He had a job doing land survey work for a county assessor's office, which she found when she heard it both painful and entirely consistent with who he had always been. He had not married. He told her, allowed himself close friendships because close friendships required a history, and his history was not available. The call between them lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. She knew the exact duration because she looked at the clock when they started and again when they finished. She did not cry during it. She asked him questions and he answered them, and he asked her questions and she answered them, and they talked in the way of 2 people who have a very great deal of ground to cover and understand that the covering of it will take more than one conversation. That it is in fact the work of the years remaining to them rather than the work of an afternoon, but that the afternoon is where you begin. He asked about Rowan. She told him about the letter, about the copies Rowan had made and updated for 20 years, about what it must have cost him to sit with the knowledge he had and the silence he had chosen. Decker was quiet for a long time after she said this. He said, "He came to see me once, in person. This was 2019. He drove up from Montana without telling me he was coming. He found me because he was an engineer, and engineers understand how to find things when they decide to find them. He stayed one night. We didn't talk much. We sat in the kitchen and drank coffee, and he looked at my garden through the window for a long time, and he didn't say anything about it. When he left in the morning, he shook my hand at the door, and he said, 'I'm going to write it down. All of it. For your mother.' She held the phone and did not say anything for a moment. He said I told him it was too late. That too much time had passed, and whatever he wrote would only hurt you worse than the not knowing." She said, "What did he say?" Decker said, "He said it was never too late to tell the truth, that it was only ever too late for it to be without consequence, and that the consequences were his to bear, not yours." She said, "He was right." Decker said, "I know. I knew when he said it. I just wasn't ready to believe it yet." She said, "Tell me about your garden." He did. He told her about the raised beds he had built in the first spring after he arrived, working from memory of the canyon beds he had left behind. He told her about the soil he had built up over 20 years. He told her about the variety of plum tomato he had developed from seeds he had carried in his coat pocket across 2 state lines, selecting for the conditions of northern Idaho over 2 decades of planting. She said, "I planted your seeds." He said, "The ones in the tin box." She said, "Yes. Last spring. Plum tomato in the north bed's pole beans along the east edge, winter squash in the south bed, once I got the drainage right." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How's the south bed draining?" She said, "Better. I extended the channel 4 feet the way your note said." Another silence, longer this time. He said, "Mom." She said, "I know." He said, "I wrote that note for you. I didn't let myself know that was what I was doing, but I wrote she, and I knew when I wrote it." She said, "I know you did." Outside the window of her kitchen in Belden, the Montana evening was doing what Montana evenings do in late spring, going golden along the ridgetops, while the valley held the last of its blue, the sky performing the slow transition from afternoon to night that had always been the most beautiful hour of the day in this place. She sat at the kitchen table, Rowan's chair empty across from her, the envelope that had waited 18 months on this same table long since opened and emptied of its contents. And she talked with her son for the first time in 21 years. They talked about what came next. He would come to Montana, not immediately. There were things to be sorted, a life in Idaho to be arranged, and a transition to be managed with the same care you bring to any significant change. But he would come. They talked about what that would look like, and what it would not look like, and what they did not yet know enough to talk about. She drove back to Belden on a Thursday in late October, the mountains on both sides of the valley holding the last of their color gold and rust and the deep green of the conifers above the aspens. She had been gone 11 days. Ruth's sealed letter was still on the kitchen table, unopened and uncollected, exactly where she had left it. She put a pot of water on for coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at Rowan's chair across from her and at the window where the light was doing what it always did in the late afternoon, coming across the hills in long, warm strips that moved slowly across the floor, and then the far wall, and then were gone. She thought about Rowan in 2019 driving up to Idaho without telling anyone. She thought about him sitting in Decker's kitchen looking at Decker's garden through the window and not saying anything about it, which was exactly what Rowan would do, which was to look at a thing carefully and let it be what it was without putting words on it that it did not need. She thought about him shaking Decker's hand at the door in the morning and then driving back to Montana alone with everything he had seen and everything he intended to do. He had done it. He had written it down. He had left her the key. She poured her coffee and sat with it at the table in the fading light, and she was for the first time in a very long time not alone in the way she had been alone. The following spring, on a morning in early May, when the last of the snowmelt had finished and the canyon trail was passable, Etty Vaughn parked behind the old station building in Belden and walked up the grade with a lighter pack than the first time. She had the iron key in her jacket pocket. She had a second notebook, knew its pages still crisp. She had 3 packets of seeds she had saved from the previous summer's planting and a small jar of the plum conserve from the canyon crocks, which she had tasted carefully in the fall and determined was still good. She crossed the bridge in clear weather. The river far below was green and fast with snow melt, the canyon walls bright with the new growth that comes to high country in spring. The pale green that is so specific to that season and that elevation that it looks almost provisional, as if the landscape is trying something out before committing to it. She found the path down and took it and came to the clearing as the morning reached its full light. There was a man already there. He was on his knees in the south bed, working the soil with his hands. And he did not hear her at first because the river made its permanent sound in the gorge below, and the wind was in the spruce above the shed, and he was paying attention to what he was doing. He was 50 years old, and he had his father's way of working, methodical and focused, and not wasting motion. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a moment and watched him. He looked up. They looked at each other across the garden beds his hands had built 23 years ago, across the cleared south-facing ground, and the rows that needed planting, and the work that remained to be done across the 21 years that had been what they had been, and were now what they were, which was the past, which was the country you came from, rather than the country you were in. She set her pack down at the edge of the clearing. She walked across to where he was, and crouched down beside him in the soil of the south bed, and looked at what he had been doing, which was extending the drainage channel, the additional distance it had always needed. She said, "How does it look?" He said, "Better. Should have been done years ago." She said, "We're doing it now." She put her hands in the soil beside his. They worked through the morning together without hurrying. She planted the seeds she had brought and the additional seeds from the tin box that she had saved from the year before, working each bed the way the conditions of the specific bed required, south-facing in the north beds and sheltered from the afternoon wind in the east ones. He finished the drainage channel and moved on to repacking the section of the river room wall that wept moisture in heavy rain, mixing clay and coarse sand from the bank below. The way the note described pressing it in layers with the flat of his palm. Around noon, she sat on the stone ledge outside the shed door and opened the new notebook. At the top of the first page, she wrote the date. Below the date, she wrote what they had planted and where, what work had been done, and what remained the condition of the soil and the drainage and the wall repair. She wrote it the way Decker had written his own inventory in the tin box for the person who came next, so they would know what had been done and what still needed doing. At the bottom of the page below the inventory, in the space she had left deliberately, she wrote Rowan. Decker, I found it. I was looking. That was enough. She looked at the words for a moment. Then she capped the pen and put the notebook down on the ledge beside her and turned her face toward the canyon and the light that was coming down through the spruce in long, clean shafts. The way light comes through old trees when the morning is still and the air has not yet begun to move, illuminating the dust and the particles of things that are always present in the air but only visible when the light finds the right angle to reveal them. Her son was 10 feet away, working mortar into the wall of a room his hands had built. The river was below them, making the sound the river had always made. The seeds they had planted were in the ground. She sat with her hands in her lap and her face in the light, and she stayed exactly where she was.